Due Process, recipient of 6 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards.
10 days after that photograph was taken, I opened my eyes in some intensive care unit of some trauma center in Daytona Beach, Florida.
But Steve Benveniste, run down by a drunk driver, amazingly survived. Now he's a lawyer who represents other DWI victims. One man's war against drunk driving, up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
A state police detective pulls 7 years in prison. A Morris County woman is sentenced to 5 to 7 years behind bars, both guilty of vehicular homicide, both examples of a new determination to get tough on drunk drivers. I'm Raymond Brown, and on our docket for this edition of Due Process, driving while intoxicated, DWI, and the legal system's new approach to a problem as old as booze and cars. We'll hear from a defense lawyer who thinks we may be going too far, from a cop who says we haven't gone far enough, and from a psychiatrist specializing in addiction who'll explain just how alcohol works on our brain, our disposition, and on our driving. But first, here's Sandy King with the story of how a drunk driver almost cost the life of a Bergen County lawyer.
Raymond, his name is Steve Benveniste, and it's horror stories like his that are behind the tough new penalties, behind the bills that would tighten the standard for what constitutes legally drunk, and behind a federal law that could cut U.S. highway funds to states that fail to lower the limit. It was Frank Lautenberg's final act in the Senate, and it would mean that in states like New Jersey, where the drunk driving standard is now 0.10% blood alcohol level, there would be a new limit of 0.08%. Steve Benveniste is among its proponents, and given his history, it's no wonder.
Well, am I even ever going to be able to go back to school again? Am I ever going to be able to read a paragraph and know what it was and what it was that I read? Will I be able to write down sentences again? I looked like I was going to be losing my left leg. Both my legs were shattered. They couldn't even cast the legs. It just was overwhelming.
But after 10 days in a coma, at least he was alive. Just barely.
I understand from what people have told me, it was such a horrific accident scene that people who didn't know me were crying in the street. It was rather disgusting and hard to look at.
He had come to Florida for spring break, a college senior's dream turned nightmare, when a drunk driver who had killed before ran him down.
He had killed 2 women in the past and crippled a third.
And had gone to jail?
He had served, he had a long sentence, but he served 1 year and 8 months. And of course I learned all this.
For 2 deaths?
For 2 deaths, yeah, for 2 deaths. And then he was back out without a license and without insurance.
It left Steve Benveniste with a sense of moral outrage and a passion for justice, along with all the pain and scars and suffering.
I had at least 15 surgeries in 5 different hospitals in Florida, New York, and New Jersey, and they were all major surgeries.
Over what period of time?
Over the period of 1 year.
He had been an athlete. He had hoped to go to law school, but the accident changed everything for a while.
Law school admission letter arrives while I'm in the coma. I get it, I see it, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, I knew enough to know that with these deficits, I didn't know if I was going to be able to finish the 6 weeks of college that I had left.
Still 2 years later, against all odds, he found himself struggling through the first year of law school.
I noticed as the year was going by, my deficits were going away one by one by one. I was starting to remember people's names. Everything was coming together. At the end of the year, I was convinced I was smarter than I ever was before the accident. My reading comprehension level was far ahead what it was before the accident.
But even with his cognitive skills coming back, there was still his mangled body.
I wanted to walk, I wanted to run, I wanted to play football, I wanted to ski. And they probably were used to hearing patients talk about everything that they wanted to do, and they really couldn't give me false hope.
So who would have guessed that 12 years later he'd be managing a daily run?
I have metal hardware in my leg holding my bones in place. I needed aggressive surgery, which included putting rods in my legs just to support myself.
A daily run and a personal injury practice.
I don't think the insurance company stands a chance on that verbal threshold motion.
With a specialty.
And I vowed never to represent someone who's accused of drinking and driving. I will not represent them in criminal court. But what I do is I represent the victims. Hey, come on in, have a seat.
Been a long time. Compared to what he had, mine was a piece of cake. Because I saw this guy in the pictures, I'm like, this is you?
Being able to connect up and empathize with a client is extremely helpful for a lawyer.
You think his background helps him to do that?
Oh, absolutely, without question.
The one benefit of my going through what I went through and seeing what my family went through and going through all those surgeries is that it's given me a passion that I never could have anticipated for every single case that I handle.
Every case and every speech.
10 days after that photograph was taken, I opened my eyes in some intensive care unit of some trauma center in Daytona Beach, Florida.
Someone who hadn't almost lost it all might say there was no time for anything else, given law and marriage and a newborn son.
Your reflexes, your judgment, your coordination, everything's impaired. You just simply don't belong behind the wheel of a car.
But once or twice every week, find Steve outside the courtroom and in the classroom with a message and a mission.
Look, if you're going to make the decision to drink, please, just don't make the decision to get behind the wheel of your car. When I see high school students, when I see tears in their eyes, I know that I'm making a difference, and I know I'm minimizing the amount of people who get behind the wheel once they made the decision to drink.
Steve, of course, defied the odds with his spectacular comeback. His case, a stark departure from the usual, unlike the all-too-common drunk driving, and it starts young. High school students already break the law every time they take a drink, and yet most say they do drink. To make matters worse, in a recent survey of teens in Middlesex County, 1 in 6 said they drink and drive.
And when we come back, a cop who works at trying to keep kids from driving drunk, a lawyer who defends accused drunk drivers, and a psychiatrist who explains why cars and booze are such a lethal combination.
I think it's a disgrace. They should go to jail and be put away for a very long time.
Jail them, take away their license, never get it back.
Fines and take their license away, and they should be put to jail or
whatever the law allows. Someone that's driving drunk should be held accountable for deaths, bodily injury.
If you jeopardize somebody else's life, you deserve to actually go to jail. It's like taking a life.
I think they should charge them the same way they would charge someone who wasn't drunk, who just murdered someone. So
I don't think people should drink and drive. As far as the punishment goes, well, it all depends on the severity of the crime. If someone dies, I believe an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth.
It's a matter of health, a matter of safety, a matter of public policy and law. Dr. Doug Zadonis is here to talk to us about how alcohol affects our brains and our ability to drive a car. Peter Letterman talks to judges about why his DWI clients deserve a break. And from Newark, fair lawn detective Derek Bastink, who lectures kids about why they shouldn't drink and drive. Detective, let me start with you, and we're talking to more than kids today, we're talking to adults, but over the last several years it has seemed as though there'd been a great deal of discussion about the question of what should be the limits, and it seemed as though we had arrived at some kind of understanding about what the level should be, what the punishments are, and now we're talking about more. Why do we need more severe punishments, and why do we need to change the level at which we say blood alcohol should be before we say a person is driving drunk?
Well, I think, Raymond, if you look at the numbers, they're astounding. Over 45,000 people a year die in the United States for drunk driving. That means over 100 people tonight during the day will die because of drunk driving accident. You look at Stephen Benveniste's story that you touched on in the beginning. I watched that. I get mad just watching that clip.
I would understand your anger, but the question, I guess, is whether you believe that going from, say, 0.10 to 0.08 is really going to make a difference in terms of death and destruction or mayhem or fair enforcement.
Well, I think it is going to make a difference. It's going to make people more aware that if they get behind a vehicle and drive, now, you know, the law is going to be the law, and that's what people need to realize. And at 0.10, your body, and I think the doctor will go into this, at a 0.05, you're impaired, okay? And we know this now, and I think we need to get on board. New Jersey is one of, I think, 17 states that does not have the 0.08 in effect. The rest of the country is at 0.08.
Sounds like you'd even go to 0.05, but let me come back to that in a minute, because Mr. Letterman is shaking his head no. In addition to being a lawyer representing individuals, you care about the policy issues. Seems like it's a mom-and-pop policy question, continue to lower the level. Why do you disagree?
Well, there are lots of different issues here. The specific issue is whether or not it should be lowered to 0.08 or not. And what's really interesting is that in the state of New Jersey, we went there and we studied that. In 1997 and 1998, the Task Force on Alcohol-Related Motor Vehicle Accidents and Fatalities, headed by Judge Menza, and the committee was a cross-section of people from our state. People who are experts in alcohol, lawyers, people from the clergy, everyday people. They evaluated whether or not the blood alcohol content for a per se violation should be lowered from 0.10 to 0.08. And their conclusion was that they could not recommend at that point in time that it should be lowered.
Right, let me ask you a question. Are you saying that you don't think there's any benefit to be derived from lowering it, or are you saying there are other things we give up as a society that don't justify that additional lowering?
What's really interesting is that if you read the report that the task force prepared, and this is a pretty thorough, in-depth report, and it doesn't just go into the question of whether or not the per se level should be reduced from 0.10 to 0.08. They address a lot of other issues that go into what would prevent people from getting killed or hurt in these accidents. And basically what they said, it was a public policy issue.
So your point is really a balance as opposed to saying that absolute number. You say there are other interests you're concerned about.
Well, it's really interesting to note that the task force adopted the opinion of then Attorney General Peter Venero. Now, Peter Venero is not a shrinking violet as to the issues of law enforcement and DWI. He was a very, you would say, he was strong for enforcement, for lack of a better expression. But his opinion was, and this was the opinion that was adopted by the task force, that most accidents occur as a result of people who are at high levels of intoxication. Usually, I tell my clients, the red line, the red line is basically 0.15. And it's from 0.15 to higher levels where accidents usually occur. And Venero's suggestion was, and I think the task force and ultimately the Senate of this state agreed, because they didn't take action. They said, let's emphasize this problem.
We'll come back.
Dedicate resources to 0.15.
Let me ask a little bit about the science, because we've talked about the law enforcement and the policy questions. What does the science say, and is there a definitive answer within the universe of science?
I would agree with the detective that I think that it's clear that we should go to 0.08, and I would think that we should also be thinking about going to a lower level like 0.05. The Center of Disease Control, just in this past November, a couple months ago, did a very nice study that looked at the effect in all those states that have reduced to 0.08 from 0.1 and showed a reduction in accidents and fatalities. So I think the data suggested. Now, from the point of view...
Mr. Letterman said, I think he was referring to the task force, that serious accidents tend to happen at a higher level. Is there some validity to that, or is it a question of lowering, and for each percentage that you lower it, you get a decrease in accidents?
I think it is true that if you are that intoxicated, you have a much higher risk for killing yourself, killing the other people. But even at the much lower levels, we are already seeing impairment. And it's also clear that even at 0.02, you're starting to see some mild impairment. And clearly at 0.05, people are having slower reaction times. Their ability to process a lot of information at the same time is reduced. Their ability to track things, all these important skills that are useful for driving. The association with trauma and driving is so clearly correlated with alcohol use that I think that the data is very strong.
Well, all right, let me ask the detective. Detective, then, why stop at 0.05? If you agree with the doc, why not say zero tolerance, no alcohol? If you got any alcohol, you should be subject to arrest and prosecution.
Well, you know, I think that would be something that would be very hard to enforce. You know, during Prohibition, look what happened. People were smuggling alcohol across state lines.
But let me tell you why I throw that out as the devil's advocate, because it seems to me that you and the doc are saying that for every amount of decrease you get, you reduce the risk. Given the risks involved, obviously there's difficulty in enforcement, but that's true in many areas. Why not go to zero? I mean, isn't that the logical extension of your position?
To a degree, yeah. I mean, we have to be, you know, let's be reasonable here. I think to say zero would be impossible. And what we found with these studies, I mean, the one doctor has a study where he says that a higher level is going to cause an accident. That's not necessarily true. There's other studies that show that going to the 0.08 will reduce the amount of accidents and will reduce death on the road. So I think a zero would be impossible to go to, but again, it's something to look at. A 0.05, definitely something to look at.
One thing we have to avoid doing is having dueling studies. And I know there are lots of studies that say that the reduction to 0.08 will facilitate safer driving. But there are other studies that question these figures. And you know as well as I do that the devil's in the details. It's how you do a study, what your methodology is. It depends upon what your definitions are. The General Accounting Office issued a study in June of 1999, and it raised questions as to the efficacy of these 0.08 studies. Now, this isn't to say that reducing the level to 0.08 wouldn't reduce fatalities and injuries. It may indeed do that. The fact is we just don't know for sure. Now, let me make a point. Sure, this is important. Here's the real issue. In New Jersey, we have what's called a per se law. And what the per se law does is it defines intoxication by virtue of blood alcohol content. It says if you have a 0.10 or higher, you are by definition intoxicated. Now, what we're not saying, and what the law in New Jersey does not say at this time, is that if you're under 0.10, you go off and nothing happens to you, because as you well know, there are two ways you can prove intoxication in New Jersey. One way is by the per se definition of intoxication. The other way is by observations, by showing that the person appeared to be intoxicated.
I want to pick up on this. This is a really important point. When we started out, and I've been practicing for 25 years, though I'm not a specialist like Mr. Letterman, the concept was there were certain behavior, loss of coordination, ineffective ability to handle the vehicle, that was really what we were trying to prevent. We've shifted to now almost a purely scientific realm in terms of the per se rule Mr. Letterman describes. And as we go lower at 0.05 or 0.08, are we still looking at the behavior that we're trying to deter, or are we now in a realm of purely scientific enforcement?
I think there are two issues. One is the reduced ability and performance to do things, which is clear that it already occurs at 0.05. Then the other issue, does that impairment result in an accident or a death, where, again, the latest data from the CDC, and we may argue over which study is better, but that is the latest study, and it also has more experience over time, as most states have already made the changes to the lower level. So I think that that data shows that even at a 0.08 level, that we should be concerned.
Right. Detective, I'll come right back. But Detective, I want to ask you a question, and I want to make sure I don't forget this one. There's some evidence that maybe 1 out of 6 kids gets behind a wheel of a car at some point with some alcohol in their blood. How do you convince kids that there are dangers and that behavior ought not to be done, given the feeling we know kids have of immortality and just the fact that kids are kids?
That's a challenging thing, and I'm sure it'll be here to stay, you know, when we're all gone. I invite people like Stephen Benveniste to where I work, and I have him speak to the students about his personal
Do you think that has an impact? I mean, it has an impact on me to see Sandy's video, but does it have an impact on kids? Do they connect that to the behavior?
Absolutely. I think we can't remind kids enough. On top of that, I come in, we do DWI, we have vision goggles that the kids put on. It shows what intoxication is like and how it makes them uncoordinated when they try to walk. We show them pictures, and we just try to remind kids that the dangers and how quick accidents happen. I mean, all we have to do, You know, I've been to too many accident scenes and seen people, innocent victims, on the highway, bones broken. It's horrible sometimes, and it's to blame it on a drink, and if they would just allow someone to drive for them. That's all we're asking.
But the reason I press this is there are so many areas of society where we have zero tolerance policies. We say to kids, just say no, and it turns out to be empty preaching without a lot of demonstrable effect.
Right. Well, you know, the laws are different when it comes to juveniles. People under 21, all they have to be is all they have to do really is register on the breathalyzer, and they're considered drunk. There really is a zero tolerance when it comes to that. But again, teenage drinking is something that's a challenge, and again, all we can do is show them the statistics, talk to them, and try to preach this into their.
And I wasn't trying to suggest you got to solve that single-handedly, but it's obviously something you work at, Mr. Letterman.
What the detective was talking about is crucial to stop people from drinking and driving. But there are two things I'd like to point out. One thing is that if you change the law from .10 to .08, how is that going to change your behavior, my behavior, the doctor's behavior, or the detective's behavior? Are you going to have 3 drinks instead of 2, or 2 drinks instead of 3 drinks? Or if you weigh 120 pounds and you're a woman, you could drink 2 drinks right now and be a .18. You can have 2 glasses of 6-ounce portions of wine and become a .08. How is this going to change people's behavior? That's the first issue. The second issue is, and I think this addresses.
Can I let him respond? Because that's a good point. Because the question is, how does that effectively, if we're having a drink, how do I know how far to go when there's that much of a tiny difference, really, that we're talking about measuring?
I think this is a really important point, because here is where I would say that we should have the designated driver zero tolerance as being the goal. Voluntarily, people choose. I think also it's clear that if you look at weight charts by gender and the amount by drink, that having 1 drink, 12-ounce beer, 4 ounces of wine, would keep you in a .02 level, where you could be more safe and where you wouldn't see some of these impairments. And then if we had a very clear message, 0 drink, designated driver best, 1 drink, that should be your max.
And that's a practice. You had another point you want.
Well, yeah, the second point is, and the doctor I'm sure will agree with me, and this is what the task force said, it's common knowledge, we know this. One of the first things that alcohol does, besides prevent your ability to drive, it affects your ability to make decisions. It affects your judgment. That's the first thing that happens. Now, you're a criminal attorney. We usually punish people when they do something intentionally, when they form an intent to do something that's wrong. That's not the case in DWI, because as people drink alcohol, their ability to make the decision whether to drive or not gets diminished.
You sound like an advocate for zero tolerance, because in a sense the response to that is to say not at all. The detective is shaking his head. What were you going to say, Detective?
Well, I think they did do something intentional there. When you start drinking to the point where you're legally intoxicated, you've gone overboard. So you've done that. No one raises the drink to your mouth. You need to know before you sit down and have a drink, all right, well, my friend's going to drive me home tonight, all right? And otherwise keep it under control, and you know that. So when you start to go beyond, there's things called taxi cabs that we can call, and they could drive us home.
Realistically, I think Mr. Letterman raises a profound point about what the law calls deterrence. Right. Does it make a difference if we lower the level to, say, .08 or even .05? Do you think that's going to change behavior or merely cause us to lock up more people? Which may also be legitimate, but is that what we want?
I think if we look at the CDC data, that it does. It does lower the amount of accidents and traumatic events and deaths. So I think, though, we do need a public message that drinking and driving don't mix.
How long have you been practicing, Mr. Letterman?
26 years.
Have things changed in terms of attitudes in the courts towards drunk driving?
That's a whole other show you may want to do. But
okay, but we only got 30 seconds, so tell me yes or no whether you think they've changed.
I think the attitudes have changed, but there is no due process, or very little due process in municipal courts.
So it's changed, but changed at a cost.
Yes, people are paying the price for being charged with this offense. They sometimes do not get fair trials because of the circumstances.
Detective, let me come back to you. Have you seen much change during the course of your time as a police officer?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely more awareness. The laws are stricter, and for a reason. And until we meet that threshold where there's not as many deaths, we need to keep working on this. And the .08 is the spot to go at this point.
Doc, let me end with you. Where are we going to be in 20 years in terms of a scientific measure that says this is the point at which we've got to cut it off and say, at this point, over this, you'll be sanctioned, below what you won't?
I think we're going to be like tobacco. Nobody thought 10 years ago that we would address tobacco the way we are today, and I think we will have zero tolerance or one drink, a very low amount.
We're going to have you all back at some point, and we'll see if that prediction turns out to be true. I want to thank you all, and thank you for coming to this edition of Due Process. But be here next week when we'll be back with another cutting-edge issue of law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King and all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching once again.
And I vowed never to represent someone who's accused of drinking and driving. I will not represent them in criminal court. But what I do is I represent the victims on a civil level of the accidents that they've caused. And what I do is I actually file suit against them, and I recover financial damages for their losses, and I do that in court. And I'm very aggressive when I do it. I'm very intense, and I have a passion that I think really sets me apart from most lawyers. And because of the injuries that I suffered, and because I realize how delicate the human body is, it's really given me a compassion. I'm more compassionate, and it's almost like my heart is in every single case that I handle. And my clients realize it too. And they never feel like they're being left out. And it's because of what I went through, and I'm certain of that.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,